Liam sighed, staring at the email confirmation on his phone. Mastering connection and confidence. It read in bold letters. Perfect, he muttered. After months of dating disasters, he was desperate for anything to help him stop screwing up every potential relationship. The seminar had cost him a week's paycheck, but if it delivered on its promise, it'd be worth it. When Liam arrived at the retreat center, though, his confidence began to falter. The sprawling estate was far more serene than he'd expected. He passed the koi pond, fields of lavender, and a massive wooden sign engraved with the Stoic Path. Inside, the receptionist handed him a pamphlet. "Welcome to the journey of silent self-discovery," she said with a serene smile. Silent?" he asked, brow furrowed. "The retreat is entirely silent," she replied. "No speaking, no phones, no unnecessary interaction. True growth comes from within." Liam blinked at her, the weight of his mistake dawning on him. This wasn't a dating seminar, it was some philosophical self-help retreat. He opened his mouth to protest, but the receptionist held up a finger. "We begin now. Silence is mandatory." As she handed him a name tag and gestured toward the main hall, he tried to decide if leaving would be worth wasting the money. He stayed, mostly because the brochure promised insights into personal power. Maybe he could spin this into a better version of himself, one that didn't drive women away after the first date. The first session began with meditation. Liam sat cross-legged on a mat, surrounded by a dozen other attendees. He kept sneaking glances around the room, trying to make sense of his fellow participants. There was an older man with a gray ponytail, a woman in yoga gear who looked like she lived off green juice, and another with a tight bun and glasses who radiated serious librarian energy. Then there was her. She wore a form-fitting tank top and yoga pants, her hair cascading in dark waves over her shoulders. She moved with effortless grace, settling onto her mat like a cat curling up in the sun. When their eyes briefly met, Liam quickly looked away, his heart pounding. The instructor began by lighting incense and signaling for everyone to close their eyes. As Liam tried to focus on the instructions, his stomach grumbled loudly, breaking the stillness. He froze, heat rising to his cheeks, but no one reacted. After the session, the participants filed out in silence. Liam lingered awkwardly, unsure of what to do. As he hovered near the doorway, the dark-haired woman approached him. "Hi," she whispered, her voice soft and conspiratorial. "I thought this was supposed to be silent, but that stomach growl was hilarious." Liam hesitated, unsure if he was supposed to respond. Before he could make up his mind, the woman winked and walked away, leaving him flustered. By the time dinner rolled around, Liam was already over the silence rule. The dining hall was eerily quiet, save for the clinking of utensils. He tried not to stare at the woman from earlier, who was seated 2 tables over. She seemed to glide through her meal, every movement precise and controlled. As he forced down his vegan casserole, Liam felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find one of the other women, a petite blonde with an oversized scarf, smiling at him. She held up a small whiteboard and marker. Asterisk. "You're very calm. Have you done this before?" Asterisk. Liam stared at the message, unsure how to respond. He shrugged, then gestured vaguely, hoping to convey, "Not really." The blonde wrote something else. Asterisk. "I think your energy is amazing. You're like a rock in the middle of chaos." Asterisk. He blinked at her, completely baffled. Before he could think of a polite way to escape, she leaned in closer, her hand briefly brushing his arm. The moment lingered awkwardly, and Liam coughed, pretending to need more water. By the time the evening session rolled around, Liam had attracted more attention than he ever intended. Several women exchanged glances when he entered the room, and he could feel their eyes on him as he settled onto his mat. During the next meditation, the instructor paired participants for a silent, energy exchange exercise. Liam ended up across from the blonde, who stared at him with unsettling intensity. As they locked eyes, she began to mimic his breathing, her face softening with what could only be described as reverence. Liam's thoughts spiraled. Was he doing this wrong? What did energy exchange even mean? When the instructor ended the exercise, the blonde scribbled something on her whiteboard and showed it to him. Asterisk. You have the aura of a wise warrior. Asterisk. Liam barely stifled a laugh, covering it with a fake cough. He avoided her gaze for the rest of the session, trying to ignore the creeping sense that things were starting to spiral out of control. As the day ended and he lay in his minimalist cabin bed, Liam stared at the ceiling, wondering how he'd managed to turn a simple mistake into what felt like the setup for a bad rom-com. He hadn't spoken a word since he'd arrived, but somehow, he was already in too deep. Liam woke up groggy, the thin mattress on his cabin bed doing his back no favors. As he stumbled into the main hall for the morning session, he realized the other attendees were already gathered, seated in a perfectly symmetrical circle. He awkwardly slid into the only open spot, trying not to draw attention, but it was clear from the glances in his direction that his arrival hadn't gone unnoticed. The instructor began guiding everyone through a series of meditative stretches, her voice calm and monotone. Liam struggled to keep up, his body far less flexible than he thought. At one point, while attempting a particularly ambitious pose, he lost his balance and toppled over with a loud thud. The room, of course, remained silent, but Liam caught the faintest smirk from the dark-haired woman across the circle. Her eyes sparkled with amusement as she quickly looked away. Liam's face burned with embarrassment, but he couldn't help feeling a strange mix of shame and pride at having caught her attention. As the session continued, he noticed more and more women sneaking glances at him. Every time he adjusted his position or wiped sweat from his brow, at least one pair of eyes seemed to follow him. Liam couldn't decide if he was flattered or unnerved. After the session, the instructor handed out blindfolds for the next exercise. Liam raised an eyebrow but complied, slipping the cloth over his eyes. He was led by the arm to a new part of the hall and instructed to stand still. The exercise was supposed to help participants connect with their surroundings by heightening their other senses. At first, it was peaceful, just the faint rustling of fabric and the scent of lavender in the air. But then someone brushed against him, their hand lingering on his arm for just a second too long. Liam stiffened, unsure if it was accidental or intentional. Before he could process it, another gentle touch grazed his shoulder. The touches became more frequent, each one more deliberate than the last. Liam stood frozen, his mind racing. Was this part of the exercise, or had he somehow become the main attraction? A warm breath tickled his ear, and he nearly jumped out of his skin. When the exercise ended and the blindfolds came off, he found himself surrounded by a semicircle of women, all of whom were suddenly very interested in their shoes or the walls. The dark-haired woman, however, met his gaze directly, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. Lunch was no less awkward. Liam tried to eat quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone, but the women were relentless. One slid a folded napkin onto his tray with a hastily scribbled message, asterisk. You have such a calming presence. Asterisk. Another strategically dropped her fork near his feet, leaning down in a way that made her intentions crystal clear. By the time afternoon meditation rolled around, Liam was exhausted, not from the exercises but from the sheer mental gymnastics of trying to navigate the retreat's increasingly bizarre dynamics. He thought the silence would make things simpler, but it had only amplified every glance, every gesture, every tiny interaction. During the session, the instructor introduced a new exercise, maintaining eye contact with a partner for 10 minutes. Liam groaned internally, knowing this would only add fuel to the fire. Sure enough, he was paired with Vanessa, the blonde woman who had practically worshipped him during the previous session. As they sat across from each other, Vanessa's gaze was intense, her eyes searching his as if trying to unlock some profound secret. Liam did his best to stay neutral, but her expression kept shifting, from adoration to curiosity to something dangerously close to lust. By the end of the exercise, Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her face just inches from his. She didn't say anything, of course, but her intentions were clear. Liam leaned back, trying to create some distance, but the movement only seemed to encourage her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of increasingly absurd encounters. During a walking meditation around the retreat grounds, Liam found himself unintentionally leading a small group of women who trailed behind him like ducklings. Every time he slowed down, so did they. Every time he sped up, they matched his pace. When the session ended, Liam made a beeline for the cabins, hoping for some solitude. But as he turned a corner, he nearly collided with the dark-haired woman from earlier. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded note. She pressed it into his hand before walking away without a word. Back in his cabin, Liam unfolded the note with trembling fingers. It read, *, "Meet me by the lake after lights out. I want to understand you better." *. He stared at the note, his heart pounding. On one hand, the attention was flattering, exciting even. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that this whole situation was spiraling out of control. As the sun set and the retreat center fell silent, Liam lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The note sat on the nightstand, taunting him with its possibilities. He wasn't sure what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: staying aloof was no longer an option. Liam spent most of the night tossing and turning, the note weighing on his mind like an anvil. The dark-haired woman's invitation felt less like a romantic gesture and more like a trap, though he couldn't exactly say why. Maybe it was the way her eyes had seemed to gleam with a mix of curiosity and determination, as if she was peeling back layers he didn't even know he had. Or maybe it was the fact that every single interaction he'd had here felt like it was teetering on the edge of absurdity. By the time morning rolled around, Liam resolved to avoid any more drama. He would keep his head down, finish the retreat, and leave without any further entanglements. But as he entered the hall for the day's session, it became clear that his plan was doomed. The women who had been subtly vying for his attention the day before had shed any pretense of subtlety. Vanessa, the blonde, took a seat right next to him, her yoga mat brushing against his. Accidentally, of course. The others weren't much better, positioning themselves at angles that ensured he couldn't look anywhere without meeting someone's gaze. The instructor announced a new activity: silent group yoga. Liam groaned inwardly. This was the last thing he needed: more opportunities for awkward physical proximity. As the session began, he did his best to focus on the poses, but it was impossible to ignore the energy in the room. Vanessa's movements were deliberately exaggerated, her stretches pushing the boundaries of what could be considered appropriate. At one point, she arched her back so dramatically that Liam nearly toppled over trying to avoid eye contact. Meanwhile, the dark-haired woman, who had placed her mat directly across from him, held his gaze through every pose with an intensity that felt less like admiration and more like a challenge. Halfway through the session, the instructor guided them into a partner stretch. Liam's heart sank. Naturally, Vanessa claimed him as her partner before he could even react. As they faced each other, mirroring a seated forward bend, she leaned in just a little too close, her hands brushing against his legs. The room's silence only amplified the tension, and Liam felt his face heat up. He tried to create some distance, but Vanessa leaned in further, her lips curving into a sly smile. "You're so composed," she whispered, breaking the silence rule without a second thought. "It's like nothing phases you." Liam froze, unsure of how to respond. Before he could even attempt to back away, the instructor clapped her hands, signaling the end of the exercise. Vanessa gave him a lingering look as they moved on to the next pose, leaving him feeling more trapped than ever. By the time the session ended, Liam was desperate for an escape. He ducked out of the hall as quickly as he could, heading for the walking trails in the hopes of finding some solitude. But his reprieve was short-lived. Barely 10 minutes into his walk, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see the dark-haired woman approaching, her expression calm but her eyes glinting with purpose. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice low and smooth. Liam hesitated, then nodded, figuring it was better to face her directly than to keep avoiding her. They walked in silence for a while, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, she broke the silence. "You're an enigma, you know that?" Liam glanced at her, unsure if she was being serious or just trying to mess with him. "Most people," she continued, feel the need to fill the silence, to explain themselves. But you just exist. It's fascinating. Liam didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. That seemed to please her. As they reached a secluded spot by the lake, she stopped and turned to face him. I don't usually do this, she said, her tone softening. But I feel like there's something about you, something I need to understand. Liam swallowed hard, his mind racing. Was this some kind of test? A trick? Before he could decide how to respond, she stepped closer, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. In that moment, Liam felt a strange mix of panic and exhilaration. He wanted to back away, to escape the chaos that had been building since he'd arrived, but a part of him was drawn to her, drawn to the possibility of finally understanding why he seemed to have become the center of this ridiculous universe. As her eyes searched his, Liam realized with startling clarity that he was in way over his head. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them, the women, the retreat, the silence that had somehow amplified every unspoken thought and desire. And as the dark-haired woman leaned in, her lips parting ever so slightly, Liam knew that whatever came next, it would be anything but simple. Liam had no idea how to untangle the web he was caught in, but he was certain that whatever had started as a quiet retreat for self-improvement had snowballed into something bordering on insanity. The dark-haired woman, who he'd come to learn was named Eva, seemed to have decided he was some kind of Stoic sage, and her presence felt both magnetic and suffocating. The retreat's final day began with a group energy alignment exercise which was supposed to synchronize emotional vibrations. Liam wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but he knew it involved standing in a circle, holding hands with the other participants. As he joined the circle, Vanessa immediately latched onto his left hand, her grip firm and borderline possessive. On his right, Eva took his hand with a touch that was light but deliberate, her fingers brushing against his palm in a way that made him hyper-aware of every nerve ending. The instructor began guiding the group through synchronized breathing, but Liam couldn't focus. Vanessa's thumb was slowly tracing circles on the back of his hand, while Eva's grip tightened and relaxed in a rhythmic pattern that felt more like a signal than an accident. By the time the exercise ended, Liam was ready to bolt, but he didn't get far. Vanessa cornered him near the refreshment table, her eyes alight with mischief. I think we've got a connection, she whispered, leaning in conspiratorially. Don't you? Liam opened his mouth to respond, but before he could get a word out, Eva appeared at his side, her expression calm but her posture radiating quiet authority. Actually, Eva said, her voice as smooth as velvet, I believe Liam and I have something we need to discuss. Privately. Vanessa's smile faltered, but she stepped back with a saccharine sweetness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course. Wouldn't want to interrupt your conversation. Eva didn't wait for Liam's response, simply took his arm and guided him toward the garden path. When they were out of earshot, she released him and turned to face him, her gaze steady. I'm not blind, Liam, she said. I see the way they look at you. But I think you and I both know there's something deeper here. Liam's head spun. Deeper? He wanted to ask, but he couldn't find the words. Eva stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You don't have to say anything. I know this is a lot. But I need to know, are you as composed as you seem, or is this just a facade? Liam stared at her, unsure how to respond. The truth was, he wasn't composed at all. He was a walking disaster, barely keeping it together in the face of the relentless attention. But before he could gather his thoughts, Eva leaned in, her lips brushing against his cheek in a gesture that felt both intimate and calculated. The moment lingered just long enough to make Liam's heart race before she pulled back, her expression unreadable. Think about it, she said, then turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, bewildered. The rest of the day passed in a surreal blur. Every interaction felt charged, every glance loaded with unspoken questions. Liam found himself dodging Vanessa, Eva, and a handful of other women who seemed to have decided that his silence was the key to some profound mystery. When the retreat finally ended, Liam packed his bag with a mix of relief and exhaustion. As he prepared to leave, he found himself cornered one last time, this time by both Vanessa and Eva. Vanessa was the first to speak, her voice low and sultry. "So, Liam, where do we go from here?" Before he could answer, Eva cut in, her tone cool and controlled. "I think Liam needs time to process." "Don't,"